Hi, and welcome to week 5 of the course. This week the video lecture is again divided into two parts. Part 1 will cover instructions and procedures, and we'll also discuss Project 6, which is the assignment for this week. And Part 2 will focus on memo format and have a little brief overview of document design. We all know what instructions are. The key is here that instructions spell out the steps. But there's a lot of other information that instructions also answer. The reader needs to know why he or she would want to complete the process that they're being instructed in. They need to know if there are any materials or equipment that are required. Perhaps even if there's any prerequisite experience or anything you have to have done before you can start this series of instructions. You need to know how to get started, you need to know how to proceed, and you need to be able to avoid difficulties that can arise, especially if those difficulties result in anything hazardous. However, instructions can take a lot of physical forms, from a brief quick start guide that you get, for example, when you buy a new cell phone, to lengthy 100, 200, 300 page manuals, to videos that we might watch that show us how to do something, and everything in between. These days, of course, increasingly instructions are taking digital forms, but there's still a place in many instances for conventional instructions, and there's often an overlap between these that really help ensure that people know what they're doing. While instructional media can take many different physical forms, there are certain common features that make instructions usable, which is to say makes them functional. The first of those things is to have a clear and limiting title. So the title needs to indicate the name of the process, or if this is related to a product, what's the name of the product, maybe what's the product number. It needs to be very specific so that the user of the instructions can differentiate and make sure that they're using the correct instructions for the product or process that they want to do. So the title should be very specific. To write effective instructions, you as a writer need to be very informed. That's what we mean by informed content. For legal liability reasons, you as a writer are liable if you give bad information out. So to give correct information, you need to have done a task yourself multiple times to be an expert in it. So it's not enough to have someone else do it. You have to have repeated experience with it yourself. Visuals can be very useful for many instructional media, especially for anything that would be hard for the reader to understand if there wasn't some sort of visual element. All visuals in instructions need to parallel the user's view, so you're creating the image so it looks as if what the user would see when they're doing the process. And also, visuals need to be paired with written material so that they reinforce one another. Many of us had the frustration of using instructional media, for example, from IKEA, where it's only visuals and there's very little verbal media to go with it. And instructions also need to use an appropriate level of detail for the process involved. Because you have to be an expert to create instructional media, you have to assume logically that the person doing this is not an expert. And in fact, if they were an expert, they wouldn't need the instructions in the first place. So always assume the readers know less than you, and always make sure you spell out anything the reader needs to know before they start the process. Instructions are also characterized by logically ordered steps. In fact, numbered steps are an important distinctive feature of all instructions. Instructions often have a very sophisticated use of document design, such as the use of section headings, numbered lists for the steps themselves, bullet point lists, maybe for lists of supplies and materials, white space to separate steps, color, maybe colored text to indicate warnings such as red or yellow text, graphics, maybe use of columns so that you have column of text paired with a column of images, different layouts effectively. So instructions can often be very sophisticated in their document design. The issues of readability and notes and hazard notices I'll discuss in another couple slides. Here's what we mean when we're talking about readability for instructions. Instructions really need to be understood on the first reading, partly because there are many people who are resistant to reading instructions on the first place, but also because people get very frustrated if they're trying to perform a task and they're not able to perform the task correctly and they have to go back and redo steps, or things get messed up because the steps were not correctly understood. For that reason, we want to make sure that each step in our instructions is very simple and concise. That means breaking things down. We want to use a particular way of phrasing instructions so that we are directly addressing the reader and we're sort of telling them what to do. That's what we mean by imperative or command mood. We want to make sure that we are always phrasing the steps affirmatively, which means we're telling people what they need to do and not what they should not do, unless we are using cautions. People get confused if you mix up telling them what to do and what not to do, because when they see something that says don't do this, but you've been telling them to do things, they'll read it the wrong way. So that's why cautions and warnings need to stand out, and they are the only things that should be negative. And we also want to avoid using what I call a telegraphic writing style. The first example here, place screw in hole, sounds like maybe something Tarzan would say. It's not that hard to add back the minor words, the articles, that make this more fluent. Place the screw in the hole. But it's even better, especially if there are multiple options here, multiple holes, multiple screws, multiple things you might need to do to add specific detail. So the third example adds the specific detail. It's still a concise sentence, it's still very direct, still begins with an active verb, it's still affirmative. Instructions also are likely to have notes, cautions, and danger notices if there is anything going on that could possibly be dangerous, or maybe things that the reader should know that would be helpful. So a note is usually more along that latter line. It's something that's going to be helpful. Maybe there are different options you could take. Perhaps the recipe you're doing is a recipe for chicken, but you could substitute tofu or you could substitute beef. Those would be options that a note could indicate. A caution, as the yellow color indicates here, is something that maybe is a little bit dangerous. The mistakes maybe aren't probable, but they're possible, and something unhappy could happen. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's really terrible. If it were a recipe, again, to use that example, maybe you would caution someone that they need to keep stirring so they don't scorch the meal. That wouldn't be a dangerous situation, but it would ruin dinner, and so a caution could be merited. A danger notice is where there is a hazard to life and limb, and it is highly important that anytime anything is that dangerous, it needs to be expressed in no uncertain terms. You express these things by spelling out what the hazard is, what will happen that could be bad if you ignore this information, but also tell people how to avoid the problem. So it's not enough just to say don't do blank. Tell them what they need to do instead. Notes and hazard notices are the only thing that interrupt the chronology of steps in an instruction. So otherwise instructions are always taking a numbered sequence of steps, but you want to put warnings in at the point that that warning information is needed. If you just throw all the warnings in at the end, the person might not hear that warning, let's say at step 4, which is where they actually need to hear it to avoid the danger. Some warnings will come at the beginning of instructions, especially if things are very severe or if it's a more general warning. But you still might want to repeat the warning at the point where that might become a problem. When it comes to writing instructions, as a technical writer, there are legal liability issues. Before, I alluded to the idea that it's important that you write instructions in terms of informed content. Here, when I'm talking about legal liability, I'm talking specifically about the risk element, the sort of coming out of the cautions and hazards element here. So it is vital from a legal perspective that you both tell users how to properly use a product, but that you also anticipate the way they could misuse the product. Some things are dangerous even when they're properly used. Think of a chainsaw, for instance. Other things are mostly only dangerous if people misuse that item, such as mascara. But you've got to think about both things. You've got to be able to discuss both benefits and risks so that consumers can make a decision as to whether they are willing to accept the risk. And when the risk is serious, as say with a chainsaw, you need to make the level of risk quite clear, unambiguous, and you need to make sure that all warning information is obvious. So generally speaking, instructions will include certain information in certain parts of the instructions. So this is a list of the kinds of things we might see in the introductory section of instructions. Not every instructional document will require all of this information. It depends on how complex the process is, or how dangerous it is, how involved it is, as to whether you will need all of these elements. But if you have these elements, if you need them, you'll find them in the introductions. Likewise, the required steps of the instructions can be simple or complex as well. They could be as simple as 3 short steps on the back of a box of instant ramen, or they could be as complicated as a manual that has multiple assembly features to run or to put together or to operate a piece of heavy machinery. So instructions could be broken down into sub-steps depending on the complexity of the process, but some instructions are very simple, in which case you would only really have what's labeled here as the first major step would be all there is, essentially. And then instructions often have brief conclusions that overview things, especially if there are complex instructions, and often they provide troubleshooting or let you know how things should have turned out. Now, I'm going to point you, if you're interested, to a car seat manual that is posted in the handouts and useful folders, useful tools folder rather, and it's a PDF of a car seat manual that will show sort of a classic kind of instruction that's in a print format that has, layering of different steps. There are steps that tell you how to install the car seat in different situations. There's steps for operation, there's steps for maintenance, there's sort of layering here. So this is an example of sort of a classic piece of instructional media. Increasingly though, we are finding a lot of online documentation for instructions, and that can be really helpful because it can include multimedia presentations, especially videos, which can be highly helpful, especially for the use or installation of a product. They can often have interactive troubleshooting elements. So we see a lot of online documentation in it, and it's wonderful. And so I'm linking here an example of some online documentation, and you can find this link also posted in the handouts and useful tools folder. And this is also an example of using different kinds of media, using both written instructional media and also video instructional media. So you might want to take a look at that. And then briefly, I wanted to mention procedures, which are kind of cousins to instructions, but they're not exactly the same things. Instructions are designed for people who are essentially noobs. The reason they need instructions is because they don't know how to do whatever it is. If they knew how to do it, it wouldn't need instructions. But procedures are a little bit different. Procedures are not for novices. They're for people who already know how to do whatever the process is involved. But what they do is they spell out the rules. So maybe there are policies that are, employment-related policies. Maybe there are laws. Maybe there are different kinds of ways that are sort of the standard operating procedures for an organization, and this is how they want it done specifically. That will be spelled out in procedures. So we're not really working with procedures in our class, but I mentioned this here, and I've also linked, and this again is in the handouts and useful tools folder, a link to some procedures. So you can see how physically they actually look a lot like instructions, and they're often organized a lot like instructions, but the information is a little bit different. Surprise, surprise, Project 6 is going to see you working with instructions. The first thing you're going to need to do after you read the assignment instructions is find some instructions to work with. These should be relatively short. If you choose longer instructions, you might want, and if they're very involved, you might just choose a subset of some longer instructions. And you could find these instructions anywhere on the internet, maybe part of something you've recently used in your home. Could be an assembly process. I get a lot of recipes for this assignment. Those are instructions too. So find some instructions, but find something that's not that great, because what you need is something that you're going to be able to critique and revise. So don't find instructions that are wonderful. Find instructions that are kind of sucky. After you find those instructions, you're going to evaluate the instructions' usability according to the guidelines presented in the textbook on page 468. So that's sort of a list of all the features that we're looking for in good instructions. And you can use that checklist as a way to sort of go through it and say, oh yes, it has this, it doesn't have this, it doesn't have that. And that'll sort of bring out the strengths and weaknesses of the instructions you have located. So you will want to find both strengths and weaknesses. If all you find are strengths, you need to find some crappier instructions. And even the weakest instructions probably have some strengths that you can talk about. Then you're going to want to consider how you would make these instructions better. What would you do to fix the problems? Lastly, you're going to rewrite the instructions. You're going to keep the strengths and you're going to fix the weaknesses. So if you're telling me in your evaluation that it's a strength that this set of instructions you found has numbered steps, I will expect to see numbered steps in your instructions too. If you tell me that it's a weakness that there are no visuals in the instructions, I will expect that your revision does include visuals because you said they were needed. The first thing you'll need to do when you create your document is paste the original instructions into your document, which either means copy and paste or type it in, scan it or screenshot it or photograph it and put in that picture. I must be able to see the original instructions in your document. Do not just give me a link. On the next page, you're going to write a memo or paste a memo in. And we'll talk about memo format later, but you're going to have a memo in which you evaluate those original instructions, in which you discuss the original instructions' strengths, the original instructions' weaknesses, and what you plan to do to make it better. And then on yet another page, you're going to have your revised instructions. So this is not part of the memo itself, this is separate. So you're going to have at least 3 pages. And you might have more if your instructions are longer than that, and that's okay. But all of these things need to be in one word process document file. What am I looking for when I'm grading this? Well, I'm looking for the original instructions. I'm looking for you to use correct memo format, which, as I say, the next slideshow video will discuss. I'm looking for organized information. So here's a tip. Maybe have a paragraph about strengths, maybe have a paragraph about weaknesses, and maybe have a paragraph with your recommendations. So that would be very readable, and you could even use section headings to help organize that information and make your memo look good. Your revised instructions also need to show logical organization and effective document design. The critique of the original instructions needs to be accurate and needs to be based on the checklist on page 468 in the textbook. I'm going to be looking to see that that's the basis of your critique, not personal opinion about things. I'm going to want to see that your revised instructions makes everything better and keeps all the things that you said were strong points. So if you say that something's a strong point, it should not go away. If you say that something's a weak point, you should fix it. And of course, your writing needs to show good grammar mechanics and to be very clear. A couple of tips here at the very end of this already long video. Do not try to pass off another person's instructions as your own revised instructions. I will spot that and you will receive a 0 on the assignment. Do your own revision. Likewise, though, don't misrepresent original instructions either. I've seen students find original instructions that are actually pretty good, but then they change them to make them bad, and then they claim that that's how they found the instructions. You've still misrepresented your source material. So don't change the original instructions. Write your own revised instructions. If you do either of those problematic things, you will get a 0 on this assignment. The other thing I will mention to you is that there is a document posted in the Handouts and Useful Tools folder that explains, that sort of demonstrates how to analyze and revise some instructions. So there's some sample instructions that are not good. There's a list of the strengths and weaknesses, and then it shows the revised instructions. It's about how to jack up a car. So again, you can find that in the Handouts and Useful Tools folder. And I highly recommend you look at that, both to see an example of what I mean by improving the instructions, and also to see sort of a full list of using that checklist from the textbook on page 468 to identify the strengths and weaknesses. And now the slideshow needs to end because it's really long, so go ahead and go over to the second video.